Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Shailesh Mehta School of Management, IIT Bombay, I take great pleasure to extend a hearty welcome to Sri Swaminathan Gurumurthy, a well-known commentator on economics and politics and a leading corporate advisor in India. Mr. Gurumurthy is an acclaimed writer who has penned thought-provoking articles in several dailies and periodicals across the country. He is well known for his radical views on raging issues. Many of his articles in the New Indian Express highlighted the disadvantages of globalization, espousing the cause of the Swadeshi movement and a united India. Along with his team of professionals and academics, Mr. Gurumurthy has studied over 25 community-driven industrial clusters in different parts of the country. A chartered accountant by training, his outstanding knowledge of economics and accounting, unconventional economic thinking, and his powerful personality have had an immense influence over corporate India. After completing his CA in 1972, he joined an auditing firm and was allotted the job of maintaining the books of some of the companies owned by press baron Ramnath Goenka. In 1976, Mr. Gurumurthy started his own firm, Guru and Bardhan. Mr. Gurumurthy has to his credit solved many corporate family issues and also brought about an amicable solution to one of the biggest corporate issues between Grasim and L&T. He was rated among the 50 most powerful persons in India in 1990 by the Gentleman magazine, as the 8th most powerful person by the Business Baron magazine in 2004, and as the 17th most powerful person by India Today magazine in 2005. It is noteworthy that his influence rests on the status he enjoys as a person and as a writer of integrity and courage, rather than power from any formal position he occupied in the government or any organization. Without taking any more time, I request Mr. Gurumurthy to grace the stage and enlighten us with his thoughts.
Mr. Adi Godrej, who delivered a brilliant, organized, well-prepared and well-structured speech before all of you. But I will be doing something very different. I had very little time to organize my thoughts. In fact, only at 11 o'clock last night, I got to know from Mr. Sudhanshu what I am supposed to talk on. So you can understand that it will be a contrast. But I would like to limit the gap as much as possible between what he said and what I am going to speak. And Mr. Devankar, Professor Karuna, Professor Sonar, and Mr. Pandali. And their students, brothers and sisters. See, as he said, there is a lot of advantage in speaking next, and there is also disadvantage. And there is an advantage in coming with a prepared mind, with a clear thought to express what you have to speak on. And there is also an advantage to come with a chaotic mind and trying to understand what the audience is and what is the ambience, what is the expectation, because this can never be forethought and forecast. So in that sense, I am at an advantage as well as at a disadvantage. It is a contextual and contemporary exposition of a very high order and with personal experience that Mr. Godrej has brought to bear on his speech. And one more, he spoke about values. You know, it is very easy to speak on values. But it is not precept and practice in this country. In this country, it is Swadhyaya Pravachana. You have to practice and then only talk. Of all the industrial groups with which I have fairly familiar personal knowledge or distant academic knowledge, I feel the Godrej group and Mr. Adi Godrej, they are capable of speaking on values, because they have practiced certain values of a high order. I would have said this even in his absence. Mr. Mr. Devan Kakkar introduced me as one of the distinguished person, along with Mr. Adi Godrej, as a person distinguished in his own field. I myself do not know what is my field. In the chartered accountants gathering, they think I am a journalist. And so they disown me. The journalists think I am a chartered accountant. They disown me. So I suffer from an identity crisis as to which is my field. Actually, one of the biggest advantages I got in my life at a very early age was to think that the society is an open air university. You've got to learn from the society. And so I am a generalist. I am no specialist in any field. And the society is providing you such a tremendous amount of experience. If you have the knack, if you have the mind, if you have the learning tendencies, and if you have the humility, the society teaches you. And I have been a student of the society for the last 40 years. And if I am going to talk to you, it is not with the background of any research or textbook or academic credentials, but only as someone who has experienced the society very intimately, compassionately, and as someone who has established and who feels a close touch with the society. And I am not one of those condescending to say, we have to give back to the society what we got. We are only sharing with the society what we have already got from them. So it is the idea of sharing, including in knowledge or material prosperity or whatever we have got in terms of name or fame. It's all part of the society's contribution to us. I always used to think, as someone who has thought about the fundamentals of economics, that if one of you is given 1 million acres of land in the moon, will you go and occupy it? You will be alone. Nothing is worth enjoying alone. Even the market value of properties go up only when the population in that locality goes up. You reduce the people, land has no value. Reduce the people, a mall has no value. Reduce the people, IIT has no value. So you must understand, people are the assets. And the quality of the people has to increase, for which what is my contribution? So this is the intimate training and the relation-based ethics with which I moved with the society. And it is in this context I will be talking some of my largely incoherent experiences, which I will try to present it as coherently as possible. And before I go further, I must acknowledge I am talking before an audience which is going to be the interpreter of India to the world, which is going to deal with the world, which is going to be the brand builder of India for the world. We have to deal with the world. We need not become the world. We need not copy the world. But we have to deal with the world. And the training that IITs, IIMs and high educational institutions provide, they must enable you to handle the world for the country. You handle the world for yourself. You handle the world for the family. You handle the world for your life. But you must also scale up your thinking that you have to handle the world for your country also. And I will go into the deeper meaning of what I am saying, not in terms of the emotional idea of India or the intellectual or historical idea of India. I will also tell you what is the economic idea of India, the commercial idea of India, or an idea of India that is capable of leading the world with a certain thought which the world has been lacking in the last 200, 300 years. I am not a great believer in speeches. In fact, when Obama became the President of America, I wrote an article in the New Indian Express which got me hate mails in hundreds, because the idea of this avenues is change as one of the important dimensions. And Obama spoke of change. And he says change is coming, coming, coming. And when he got elected, he says change has come. So I wrote that in Srimad Bhagavatam there is a verse about what Kali Yuga would be. It must have been written at least 1700, 1800 years ago, according to the dating of our history, in which there is a small sentence, very pithy, which says that in Kali Yuga, orators will be mistaken for scholars. So I am not a great believer in oration, not because I am a scholar. To be recognized as a scholar, I don't believe in oration. But the fact is, speech has become one of the most dishonest means of communicating things which you don't practice. So it is you have to qualify to talk. And today, the qualification to talk is on such externals. There is no internal evolution required for a person to share his thoughts at all. Status-based talks, name-based talks, position-based talks, and we also glorify these thoughts and talks. So I always believe that sometimes writing is better than talking, because at least you contemplate a lot before you edit it and then put it in proper words, rewrite it, and then make yourself understandable. Talk is very, very superficial, and so this is not one of my indulgences. Now let us come to the topic, change, evolve, and sustain. Sorry. See, there is a meaning attached to each one of these words if you can go into it deeper. Is the change what you call? It is related to time. And there is an Indian meaning of change. And there is a Western meaning of change. It has philosophy about change in that sense. And if you link change to evolution and sustainability, and I will give you a historical background as Mr. Adi Godrej gave a contemporary and futuristic background, I will relate myself to history a while as to what this means. You know, in the Western philosophy, the whole world is moving towards a deterministic course and to a climactic final act, which could be Armageddon or whatever, but the world is only moving forward. And it has been scientifically also tried to be attempted to be explained by Darwin. It is only movement forward, and there is nothing like a man checking back or the whole civilization standing for a while to think, to introspect, whether to go this way or that way. This kind of a different approach is not internalized in the Western civilization. Now, I have a few questions in mind. I thought I would share it with you. The change that we are talking about, is it change with continuity or without continuity? Karl Marx said it has to be changed without continuity. That change is revolution. If you have revolution, is it sustainable? Or is it an evolution? Evolution always presupposes that you proceed from stage A to stage B. And in terms, actually Karl Marx wrote a couple of articles about India, even before he wrote the Das Kapital in the year 1853 in New York Herald Tribune. It's a brilliant exposition for a man who has never visited India, who had only perceived India through the kind of information which must have passed so slowly and so with so much of editing. And he said, India is one of the countries which has achieved a tremendous amount of civilizational enlightenment, economic prosperity. And it has conceived of an economy which he later on defined as Asiatic model of production, where he said it's a small republic where the distance between consumer and producer is so little. And it had achieved what he had later said as the primitive socialism. It had achieved a socialistic model of very high level of equality, which no other civilization could achieve. But he said the problem with India is, for 2000 years it has not changed at all. And without change, a society can never come up. And if India has to change, India has to be prepared for a revolution. And India can never revolt so long as its socio-economic model is as it is, and so the British is doing a very creative destruction in this country, and so India is being prepared by the colonial rule. Otherwise, anti-colonialist Marx said the colonial destruction work in India is a preparation of India for a revolution. But India never revolted. You must understand the history of a nation in which you are living, which you are never allowed to learn in any educational institution in this country. History, as Churchill said, Mr. Godrej quoted Churchill. He said, history is written by the victors. A victorious civilization of the last 200 years. Victorious countries, victorious politicians, victorious dictators, so to say, because before 200 years, 150 years, there was nothing called democracy. They wrote the history and we read them. When we read them, quote them religiously and understand ourselves through the history which they have written. And Mr. Gardner spoke about the Hindu rate of growth. You know, this term is settled in our academic discourse. But it happened in sometime in 1970, when Japan rose as a very powerful economy. It rang the bell somewhere in Europe. As to how Japan is rising. Because after all, economic development is the prerogative of the Western civilization. How can Japan rise? Is it an accident? But one thing which you must give due credit to the West is, they will always take note of any risky development elsewhere. So what happened? One Paul Bayrock, he is one of the well-known economic historians. He studied economic history in Paris and Brussels. In 1970, he began to do research as to how Asia, which is written off as a third world structure, how Japan is rising in this. And he came out with astounding findings, not only about Japan, about the entire third world and about Europe itself. And he said, he studied the economic history of the world and came to the conclusion that in 1750, India's share of world GDP was 24.5% and China 32.8%, and the third world share was 73%. And you will be stunned to know that that of Europe was just 7% in 1750. This shook the Western establishment to think that we all thought economic development, prosperity, standard of living is our forte. And now a huge question has been raised that it is a case of rags to riches for us. And we were always a poor third world nation, even in 1600 and 1500. The question which Paul Bayrock raised, Ferdinand Brendel and Lobier and later Bayrock said that the thought that the West was always rich was wrong, that the West was a poor, and as compared to the rest of the world, we didn't have that kind of high standard of living. This shook the Western thinking. Then Angus Maddison, who led the greatest research in this field, instituted by the OECD Development Studies Center, he came out with his results between 2001 and 2007, and he passed away in the first half of 2010, just now in May or June. And he came to the conclusion by writing his final book, OECD India Development Studies Center, The World Economy, Millennial Perspective. He gave a 2000-year perspective of the world, in which he said, the share of India in world GDP in the first year of the millennium, 2000 years back, was 32%. That of China, 28%. And the whole of Asia, 73%. And in 1500 years later, India 24%, China 25%, Asia 65%. And in 1700, India 25%, China 22%. In 1820, India 16%, when Britain was 8%. And Madison raised this issue after Bayreuth research. If Bayreuth were true, the Western rise is not an issue of science and technology. It is an issue of robbing and colonizing and destroying the third world, and that is what Angus Madison research finally established. This is not what is taught in any of the educational institutions today in India, because it will promote the confidence of India about itself. And we were in line with the thinking of Max Weber, who in the year 1920 wrote a book, Sociology of Economics, in which he said that in modern economic development of the capitalist model in which the market plays the principal role, only the Protestant Christian model can make the society compliant with the current needs, and two societies can never develop in this, and that is the Hindu and Buddhist societies. These people are condemned to remain undeveloped. 1920, you know, Max Weber is supposed to have had the greatest influence on the social economic thinkers and policy makers in India in the last 100 years. So the subject that was taught to us was that we were a failed civilization. That this civilization can never grow. You have to discard your history, you have to discard your culture, you have to discard your sociology, you have to discard your belief systems. Then only you qualify for development. This was the thought which dominated the modern Indian intellectualism. This was completely blasted by the Angus Madison research. And when this thought of Hindu rate of growth came, there was no Angus Madison study. That India was the leading economic engine of the world was not known to the Indians. It is the socialist rate of growth which was tagged on to the Hindus. What did they do? They led the world for 1700 years. And it is not Gurumurthy who is saying it. William Dalrymple, when he wrote an article on the 60th anniversary of India's independence, he said it is the empire which is striking back. It is not a poor nation attempting to become a rich nation. It's not a weak civilization which is trying to become a superior civilization. India occupied the highest place in history, and he quoted Angus Madison for the first time. It is not just Angus Madison. It is not an isolated research. It is a research which has been going on for the last 30 years, started by Paul Bayreuth, and it has been continuously being renewed, and ultimately OECD owned it up as the final, determinative, legitimate economic history of the world. So William Dalrymple said, India is striking back to regain its position. First, we must change our ideas about India. We must change the ideas about ourselves. Anyone who stands on the podium and talks in English today blames India, derides India, demeans it. It's all available on internet. I forget his name. He said the greatest quality of India is that it dominated the mind of China for 2000 years without sending one soldier out and without sending one evangelist out. It is the Chinese who sent their people, learned Buddhism from there and imported it there. You never attempted to convert anyone. You never attempted to bring anyone to your way of thinking. You lived a way which was so attractive to people. They try to learn from you. Are you willing to position yourself as that India? Or are you going to position yourself with civilizations whose change has no continuity, whose evolution has no sustainability. I'll just go into the American economic and financial model to which Mr. Godrej adverted to. The financial structure of America was supposed to be one of the most efficient. In fact, in his book, The Turbulent Times, Alan Greenspan said, the whole world is stunned as to how America, which is not doing any meaningful saving at all, is able to live and live well. And it's of course true, Asia is generating 3/4 of the global savings. And it is true that we are borrowing 3/4 of the global savings. And you are all laughing, he was very serious. He said that these poor people are saving. But what will they do with their savings if we don't borrow? They must have avenues for investment, you know. And we borrow and make their savings meaningful, and these poor people save. Very words, huh? It's not poor people, he says insecure people. These insecure people say because they have an unenlightened government, which do not take care of the unemployed people, infirm people, aged people. They don't have meaningful social security systems. And because we have all this, our people need not save. And not only they need not save, they can borrow and spend. And it is only insecure societies where unenlightened governments function, they have to save. This was the economic model. And you know what happened to that? I will just give you certain stunning facts which all of us should know about the American economy. You know, the American economy from 1976 to 2009, this is the transformation period of not American economy or the world economy, but the economic thinking, economic theories of the world, which I will advert to when you talk about change and sustainable change. The change which occurred in economics, economic development, economic theories have been proved, accepted, admitted to be unsustainable. That's what I'm coming to. Between 1976 and 2009, the US public debt rose up by 39 times and their GDP by 14 times. And their external debt grew by 137 times in this period. This is the macroeconomic picture for which there is a microeconomic cause of an economic model which told the people you need not save. You spend. And that was glorified as a consumption-based lifestyle. And with the result, American economy, which grew in power and influence, lost its base. The families became bankrupt. Economy became strong at the cost of the families. And throughout this 20-year discourse, those who are familiar with economic theories, they will know that the Japanese banking model was derided as inefficient, incompetent. And this kind of banking system is useless for market economy. Market economy means resources should be distributed by market. Stock markets, bond markets, derivatives. This is the kind of discourse which was going on the one hand, but Japan was holding on to its own model. It was never giving it up. It was a bank-driven model. It was not a market-driven model. They had aligned the bank and the market and the community and the society and the family and culture and tradition and produced another brand of capitalism which did not have anything in common, though it had everything meaningfully to deal with the Western market system. This is worth studying. And when in 2009, the whole world was shaking. Japan, which was abused for so long. You look at the Japanese Bank of Japan's website. There was only one sentence. The whole world is in turmoil. Japan is safe. And the Bank of International Settlements, in which the Japanese central bank officials wrote an article. This article is worth reading, in which I quote for you 2 paragraphs. The Japanese households prefer bank investments. The bank investment in Japan yields nothing. 5-year bank deposit yields 0.8% interest. And the banks in Japan, in order to avoid a deflationary tendencies, advised by the whole world that you must keep on cutting down the rate of interest so as to diseconomize, so as to make it uneconomic people to save and make them spend. So the Japanese economists, central bank began cutting down the rate of interest from 1992 when Japan went into deflation from 5% to 4% to 3% to 2% to 1%. The Japanese did not spend. Then the Japanese central bank said, we will give you no interest. The people did not spend. They were saving. In 2001, the central bank said, it is not only we will not give you interest, you have to give interest for us to keep your money. Even then they didn't spend. %51% of the Japanese savings is in bank deposits of 0.8% interest or less, or by paying interest to the bank. Japan says, why do Japanese households prefer deposits so much over risky financial assets? When all financial instruments, well developed, on par with any Western market, are freely traded in Japan, the equity investment of the Japanese household sector is just 9%. In India, the annual savings which is diverted to stock market, 3%. The entire BSE index of 500 companies, it represents 4% of India's GDP. The BSE Sensex represents 1% of India's GDP. But we want to understand India through Sensex. We want to understand India through stock market. You can't understand Japan through stock market. You can't understand India through stock market because the established situation today is, in all family-based societies, stock markets are not the principal means of raising and distributing resources. It is only the banks. And so he says, we would thus argue, the authors say, this article appeared in 2009, we would thus argue that the conservative approach to debt taken by the Japanese households mitigated the effects of decade-long economic slump. We would venture to say the Japanese household sector, far from being a shock originator, is a shock absorber. Exactly the reverse in America in 2008. This household sector became the shock originators, shock generators, not only for America, for the whole world. It was the American economic setback which transformed into a crisis, that transformed into a global meltdown. Even today, there is no means of recovery. All talks of recovery are false. The total amount of money committed, spent, futuristically committed, amounts to $23.7 trillion. This is what sustains. And there is no actual production or consumption to back this rise. I will just Economist magazine was cited by Mr. Godrej. It is the greatest opinion maker of the world from the Western perspective. This entire economic theory which was developed in the last 30 years or so, that you can have a financial model in which you make use of people, families, communities as factories to produce demand, and that is a successful model, has just collapsed. This is the Economist issue of 2009 June. You can see how the economic textbook is melting. And I will tell you what they write. of all the economic bubbles that have been pricked, few have burst more spectacularly than the reputation of economics itself. In the wake of the biggest economic calamity in 80 years, the economist's reputation has taken a beating. Their pronouncements are viewed with more skepticism than before. The profession itself is suffering from rancor and guilt. I will come to you as to how economic theories promoted this crisis. Paul Krugman, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2008, argued that much of the past 30 years of macroeconomics was spectacularly useless at best and positively harmful at worst. Barry Eichengreen, a prominent American economic historian, says that the crisis has cast into doubt much of what we thought we knew about economics. Are viewed with more skepticism than before. The profession itself is suffering from rancor and guilt. I will come to you as to how economic theories promoted this crisis. Paul Krugman, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2008, argued that much of the past 30 years of macroeconomics was spectacularly useless at best and positively harmful at worst. Barry Eichengreen, a prominent American economic historian, says that the crisis has cast into doubt much of what we thought we knew about economics. All of you know about Black-Scholes model. You must be studying it. It's being taught even now. Is being taught or not? This evolved from 1970 after the fixed exchange rate system broke up. You see, currency is supposed to be the denominator by which you decide the value of everything else. Then currency itself became a branded commodity, and one brand began competing with the other. And so they had to neutralize this by theoretical formulation, and that is how the Black-Scholes models developed from 1970. It entered the market in 1986-87 when the derivatives became a popular instrument. It developed in 1977-78. The derivative total turnover in 1977 was about $1 billion or so. But at the peak of the economic crisis in 2007, the derivative turnover in American, that is the Federal Reserve System recorded transaction alone, was $3.7 trillion a day. And the total derivatives outstanding at the peak of the crisis in 2007, as recorded by the Bank of International Settlements, was $596 trillion. The actual transactions represented by this was just $15 trillion. You can understand the explosion of money which did not represent any real wealth, any real work, any real wages, any real income. And entire thing was promoted on this Black-Scholes model. And the theory said, you can, to put it in an understandable language, that you can speculate without losing. This is a simple model. And this entered the market in 1994. And the two economists who promoted it, who theorized it, Robert Merton, he's one of the well-known macroeconomic thinkers, and Myron Scholes, they joined this long-term capital management, which experimented this model, and banks and financial institutions and corporates stood in queue to give the money to LTCM, which promised a minimum of 18% return. And it did give in 95, 96, 97. Seeing this, the Nobel Committee was so impressed. In 1997, they gave Nobel Prize to this model. In 98, the LTCM collapsed. And Robert Merton and Myron Scholes went back to some IIT for teaching. Poor fellows, they put the money in this, their Nobel laureates, as the money that they got, they put it and lost. But it is still being taught. So the economic crisis was because of economic ideas. New economic ideas have come. Changes have come. Are they sustainable? No idea is sustainable unless it is backed by the living models of the people. You cannot divorce an idea or a development or a policy or an economic theory which is divorced from the models of the people. That's what Japan does. Japan has aligned its rate of interest, aligned its market, aligned its bank, aligned everything to the way the people live. The people want to save and live a very frugal life. And the corporates work on a very thin profit margin. That is how we have to evolve our changes also. Our changes cannot come. It cannot be extrapolated. All the changes that we are trying to do in this country is by extrapolating ideas, extrapolating institutions, extrapolating expressions, extrapolating living models. It won't work. It requires some much more basic and fundamental understanding of human nature, for which we have to go through these 2000 years of history. It is available. You have not done it. Somebody else has done it. Study it. But we don't want to study anything good about India. If somebody says something wrong about India, in fact, this is the question which I have always asked. Mr. Adi Gadre spoke about entrepreneurship here. The Global Entrepreneur Monitor study, India entered for the first time in 2002. In 2003, the Entrepreneur Monitor study came out with its findings, what India was. It says, GEM study, in the age group of 18 to 64, India is 17.9% of the Indians are entrepreneurs. It is 11% in China, 10% in America. We don't know that in the year 2006, the Government of India made a study of non-farming business enterprises in this country. Non-farming, unregistered business enterprises in this country. Mr. Adi Gadre spoke about SMEs. This is not that. That is still lower. What I am talking about. This NSSO made this study. And this first study was made in 2002. A more comprehensive and better sampled study was made in 2006. And they came to the conclusion there are 43.2 million non-farming enterprises employing 9.8 crore people, for which organized finance comes only to the extent of 1.5%. 92% of the Indians are entrepreneurs. Only 8% of the Indians are employed. But we don't recognize anybody as an entrepreneur unless he talks in English. My understanding of this country underwent a complete change through my empirical study, which I started in 1993 in Ludhiana. When I went to Ludhiana, I was stunned at the development. And nobody could speak in English. Because I always related development to English. And I thought, here is someone, they are importing 7.5 lakh workers from Bihar. It is like America importing workers from elsewhere. And no infrastructure, nothing. You heard of one Ramgarhia community? I saw a sick man here, you must ask him. And that Ramgarhia, when I asked them, how did this development take place? How did Ludhiana establish a technology of a very high order in cycle spare parts? They said, sir, here is there one community called Ramgarhia community. You know, sir, if they see you, they can make you. You know, Ramgarhia community has been banned in most of the factories in Germany. Because they produce the whole thing here. It is there. You go into website, you will find tons of material on this community. It opened my eyes. Then I went to Batala, then Rajkot, then Jamnagar, then Jalandhar. In Jalandhar, I went to one of the factories, woodworkers' factories, where the man said, "Sir, the entire Australian Cricket Control Board places his orders on me." 1994, 3 crore worth orders. They don't buy cricket bat from anybody. It is made in our factory. See that carpenter who is making the factory? See his Maruti car standing outside. And he makes, sometimes when his mood is good, he makes 50 willows a day and we pay him 150 rupees to a willow. My idea has completely changed. Which is the place in India which has the highest per capita income in India today, tell me? Not Bombay, not Delhi, not Chennai, not Bangalore. I exclude, not Calcutta. No. It is Morbi in Gujarat, where you see this Ajanta wall clock being made as household enterprises. Children work on it. Elders work on it. Women work on it. It's largely done by the Muslim community there. In my introduction, you said that 25 industrial center community clusters I visited. We have visited 42. I have spent nearly 1/2 of my lifetime between 1994 and 2001 studying the real India, the enterprising India. You know, 70% of the oil tankers which are circulating all over the world, all over India, are owned by people in Namakkal. And they only graduated from being lorry drivers and cleaners into owning this. If Tatas or Ashok Leyland want to decide what is the demand for lorry chassis, they have to go to Namakkal for their market study. Do you know this? Have you studied Chari's book? This Boston Consulting Chari research worker study on Tirupur. Tirupur has achieved $2 billion knitwear export. 69% of the exporters have studied less than 8th standard. Only 7% are graduates. 300 exporting families. They have shaken the world. When Boston Consulting wanted to study where is this Tirupur, they didn't find the Tirupur any dot in India. When they Googled, they couldn't find. And then with great efforts they were able to locate. And they went to the PSG Institute of Financial Management, where my friend was a professor. And they said, we want to go to Tirupur. Boston Consulting has asked us to take them to Tirupur. So we provided all the logistics, arranged for everything. And they produced this finest research which entered the development report of the World Bank in the year 2000 to say how a completely new economic model which the community has devised for itself, family-based, backed savings, and a knowledge distribution model which is informal, untainted, flowing, and it has set up a world-class production center. Did we study? I came to the conclusion. Sradi Gadre spoke about research. Research does not mean you sit in a laboratory or a library. You go into the society. How Coimbatore became such a big industrial center? Has anyone studied it? Our understanding of India is as good or as bad as an American's understanding of India. We have to change our mindset. Once you change our mindset, we will evolve as very different individuals, as very different Indians. I came to talk about many other things. But the discourse here, the atmosphere here, directed me to say all that I told you. And I conclude my speech with an incident in the life of Maharishi Aurobindo. Aurobindo came to Pondicherry when the entire revolutionary movement had been crushed in this country. There's complete darkness everywhere. Aurobindo was a foreign educated person. His father sent him to America at the age of 5 so that he doesn't grow with slaves. He wanted his son to be a world conqueror. And when he came back to India, he became a revolutionary. Then he went to Pondicherry. And it is worth knowing how his transformation took place when he delivered a speech in a place called Uttarpara. That was his last speech in Bengal, which is one of the greatest intellectual exposition about India, about which we will not be taught in our schools or colleges. You have to read them only in, of course, internet is available today. When Aurobindo went to Pondicherry, there he was looking for guidance from a madman called Kullachami. He was a mystic. The man was going around like a madman. Aurobindo was saying, I will get guidance from this fellow. Everybody thought Aurobindo had become mad. And Kullachami was a great mystic, about whom Subramanya Bharati has written poems. So one day Aurobindo was sitting in his backyard. He was having a cup of tea in the morning along with his colleagues. And Kullachami came and lifted the teacup in front of him. It was overflowing. He showed the full teacup to him. He emptied it and showed it to him, put it and left it. Aurobindo said, I have got a lesson of my life. They said, you have lost your tea. What have you got? Aurobindo said, he has told me to empty my thoughts and begin thinking afresh. That is my appeal to all of you. Thank you very much. If you are all clear about what I said, don't ask questions and confuse yourself and others. Somebody is asking.
Hello sir, I am from the aerospace department. I am Saptarshi. I would like to know, would you ever write a book about India? Given that in 1 hour you could tell me so much, I think a book would someday be something worth reading.
I have about 150 manuscripts, fully backed by enormous amount of empirical work. But I have still not concluded. And once, maybe in the next couple of years I will do it. I don't want to write a book simply because it will sell in my name. I want the book to be satisfying to me. That's why I'm waiting. Maybe in the next couple of years I will come out with... It's not that it is going to change the world, but it will be satisfying to me.
Hello sir, this is Chetan. Like you said, institutions in India do not teach us about all this past and all. So in case if a course is needed, what should it be? It should be about sociology. Should it be about the sociological impact on economy, or should it be about India's past and its effect and how it can go ahead? What exactly should the content, what could it be so that it can make a greater impact for the students?
See, 30 years back what I said would have had no meaning to the West. But the West itself has a tremendous amount of tremendous amount of interest in civilizational studies. After not only Samuel Huntington, but even a person who defined the very theory of globalization, Francis Fukuyama, spoke about civilizational and cultural background of a society and their role in framing the socio-economic, political and geopolitical models of that society. In India, absolutely there is no research in this field, but there is tremendous amount of materials available, and all these materials are available in the internet today. The amount of work the Indians have done, amazing amount of work done, but it is not owned up by the establishment. The establishment India continues to be a colonial India. It is more Western than India. It cannot understand the sensitivities of India. It has no emotional empathy for India. It regards India as a problem, a difficulty, a burden. We all used to think the Indian population was a problem. After demographic economics was developed by the West because they became demographically disadvantaged, now we are thinking there is demographic dividends in this country. 30 years back you were thinking these people better die than live. So we must understand that unless we own this country, unless we own its past and civilization, there are 51% of the families are single parent families. Many American sociologists expect that by 2030, America will have a criminal population of almost 25 million. These problems are unaddressable within the confines of modernity. But we have been able to handle modernity. We wear our dress, we are modern. We go back home, we are traditional. We have been able to give a new meaning to modernity. We can handle the modern world without being modern. This is the civilizational resource of India. This is the social capital. That you don't feel alienated from the world. You don't hate the world for what they are. But you can still handle them. This is the philosophic tradition of this country, of not tolerance, but accepting different ways of life. We require study groups. We are very intelligent people. It is difficult to assemble these people. That is what IIT does. It is difficult to assemble all of you in a place without IIT. But don't think this classroom is going to teach you everything. This provides you the context to know things. It doesn't provide the text. We must seek out the text elsewhere. That's where I think some kind of this, we arranged 29 lectures in Coimbatore, where we made the performers, the 5th class, 6th class studied people who have performed, made machines, made exports, and taught them to professionals, academicians, and IAS officers. It was a hugely different program. Otherwise, the performers come and listen to all these people wearing suit, coat, everything, and they go away thinking they know better. But it is the performers who know everything. These fellows keep on making policies, you should not do this. They know what the problems are on the ground. You ask the people running 43.2 million non-farming enterprises, how many problems they have with the government? So my thing is, unless there is a total change in the mindset, when you change, when you want to change, the change is needed here. And there these brilliant minds can work, provided you have that empathy for India. This civilization has not disturbed anyone. It has been a subject of disturbance. It has not invaded anyone. It has been a subject of invasion. It has not exploited anyone. It may have exploited with him. It never went out and exploited. But have we got that respect for this society? Respect for its traditions, culture, civilization? This is a matter for a debate. You need not accept what I say, but this is a question I raise. The best minds will have to understand it. You go and quote Milton to America. They don't want it. They want you to quote something from your literature, some Kambaramayana, some Kabir. You know nothing. You become the carbon copies of the West. How will they respect you as someone with some understanding? The blame was laid at the feet of Japan. They didn't know English. They didn't want to know English. You know, there is a beautiful book. I forget the name of the author, in which there is a candlestick model of analyzing stock market. This originated in Japan. When a businessman was looking at these candlesticks charts, an American scholar, he asked him, is it candlesticks? He said, do you know about it? He said, yes. How did you come to know about it? No, I was talking to some Japanese and he told me about it. He said, I'm surprised. Because for 20 years we have kept this candlestick model safe in Japanese language. You must understand. When you learn others' language, you must know about them. And it is not to forget about yourself. So I think it's a huge question I am raising. I am competent to raise this question only because I have been part of you. I can understand you. I can understand the modern India, English educated India, the business India, professional India, the media India. God provided me tremendous amount of opportunities to be familiar with, empathize, understand, disagree without hate. With that experience, I am raising this question, a very profound question I am raising, that you must all have open mind to understand India, not to neglect right of India, not to glorify civilizations which have come and gone, as Swami Vivekananda said, like ripples on the face of the waters. And you must understand the American economic system has all, not economic, financial system has all but collapsed. You need note the date and the time, and when it is announced, you believe me, in 1995 I wrote about this. In fact, many hedge funds in the world are asking me, how did you write this? I said, very simple. I took the people to be stable and institution to be transitory. You took the institutions to be stable and people to be transitory. And that's the difference. Thank you very much for all the patient hearing.
Thank you, sir, for that thought-provoking speech. I'm sure your thoughts on change, evolve, sustain, learning from the society, people as an asset, and an ethics-based society enlightened the audience and gave us fresh food for thought for a long time to come. I now request Sudhanshu to present a memento to Mr. Gurumurthy. Thank you, Sudhanshu. Ladies and gentlemen, like all good things that come to an end, we have reached the end of this session of Alankar. I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedule and being with us today. I would also like to thank the audience for their rapt attention and participation. With this, I formally conclude the morning session of Alankar. Do join us in the evening at 6 p.m. for yet another captivating speech by Mr. Subrata Roy, Managing Worker and Chairman of the Sahara Group of Companies. I request the audience to remain seated while the guests are escorted out. Thank you.
Just 1 minute. I forgot to tell you, in my whole study, it is the women of India who have built the economy of India. This has been my study, and I spoke in the year 2005 in Sunny Valley in America, which is available on YouTube. Indian economy has a feminine character. I would like all of you to listen to that speech. Then you have no other work to do. Thank you very much.